The train rattled through the Texas plains in the late summer of 1945, carrying cargo that would confound every expectation of war. Inside the windowless freight car, 23 prisoners of war sat in silence, their German uniforms faded and torn, their eyes fixed on the floor. Among them were 4 women. 3 wore the insignia of military nurses. The 4th had been a telegraph operator on the Western Front. All 4 were pregnant. Anna Mueller sat with her back against the cold metal wall, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. At 26, she had seen more death than most people witness in a lifetime. She had wrapped the wounds of dying soldiers, held the hands of boys who cried for their mothers in languages she didn't speak, and walked through hospital wards where the stench of gangrene hung like fog. Now, 7 months pregnant, she was being delivered into the hands of the enemy. The rumors had circulated through the holding camps in England before their departure. America would extract its revenge slowly, some said. Others whispered of forced labor in mines, of starvation rations, of experiments conducted in secret facilities far from oversight. Anna had heard one story about pregnant women being separated from their babies at birth, the infants sent to orphanages while the mothers were worked to death in factory camps. She had tried not to believe it, but when the ship had crossed the Atlantic and they had been loaded onto this train without explanation, without destination, fear had coiled tight around her chest. Beside her sat Greta, a nurse from Bavaria, her pregnancy barely showing at 4 months. Greta had not spoken since they left the port. Her eyes had the hollow look of someone who had already surrendered to whatever fate awaited. On the opposite bench, Liesel kept touching her neck where a small silver cross used to hang before it was confiscated. She was 8 months along. Her breathing labored in the stifling heat of the sealed car. Through a narrow gap in the wooden slats, Anna could see endless stretches of empty land. So much space. In Germany, every meter of earth had been fought over, bombed, saturated with blood and ash. Here, the land seemed untouched, almost indifferent to the war that had consumed half the world. "Where do you think they're taking us?" Liesel whispered, breaking the long silence. No one answered. There were no good answers. Anna closed her eyes and pressed her palm against her abdomen, feeling the subtle movement of the life inside her. The baby kicked, a small flutter that seemed impossibly fragile. She had made a promise to this child, spoken silently during the darkest nights in the field hospital, when artillery fire shook the earth. "You will not know war," she had whispered. "Whatever comes, you will not know this." But now, as the train carried them deeper into enemy territory, Anna wondered if that was a promise she could keep. The train lurched to a stop. Outside, voices shouted commands in English. The heavy bolt on the door scraped open, and sudden daylight flooded the car, blinding them. American soldiers stood on the platform, rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces hard and unreadable. "Out. Everyone out. Keep your hands visible." Anna struggled to stand. Her center of gravity shifted by the weight she carried. A soldier stepped forward, and for a moment their eyes met. His expression flickered with something she couldn't name. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort. Then his face went neutral again, and he gestured toward the platform with the barrel of his rifle. They were marched single file through a small depot and loaded onto covered trucks. The road was unpaved, kicking up dust that coated their throats. After an hour, the trucks stopped before a sprawling compound surrounded by double fences topped with coils of barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, searchlights already mounted though the sun was still high. This was Camp Hearn. This was where their new existence would begin. The gates opened with a metallic screech, and they filed through under the watchful eyes of soldiers who lined the entrance. Inside, rows of wooden barracks stretched toward the horizon, each identical to the next. The air smelled of creosote and dust and something else. Something institutional and impersonal that made Anna's stomach turn. They were directed to a processing building where their names were recorded, their belongings searched, their bodies examined by military doctors who spoke no German and showed no warmth. The female prisoners were separated from the men and taken to a smaller compound on the eastern edge of the camp. Captain James Howard stood on the steps of the administration building, watching the new arrivals with his arms crossed. He was 34 years old, a career officer who had spent most of the war stateside, managing prisoner logistics while his friends died overseas. He had requested combat duty 5 times. 5 times he had been denied. "You're more valuable here," his commanding officer had told him. It had never felt like consolation. Howard's gaze lingered on the pregnant women as they were escorted past. He had not been informed that any would be arriving. Pregnant prisoners complicated everything. There were regulations, protocols, medical considerations. He would need to file reports, request additional resources, justify every decision to commanders who were already skeptical of his methods. But that wasn't what troubled him most. What troubled him was the memory that surfaced unbidden as he watched Anna Mueller walk past, one hand supporting her lower back, her face pale with exhaustion. His wife Margaret had carried herself the same way in her 7th month, before the complications began. Before the fever took both her and their unborn son. That had been 2 years ago, an ocean away, but the wound still felt fresh. He turned away and walked back into his office, closing the door harder than necessary. Inside Barrack 7, the 4 pregnant women sat on narrow cots, staring at the bare walls. The building smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. There were windows at least, though they were covered with wire mesh. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the breeze that leaked through gaps in the walls. "What do we do now?" Greta asked, her voice small. "We wait," Anna said. "We survive." Liesel began to cry softly, her shoulders shaking. Anna moved to sit beside her, putting an arm around the younger woman. "We're still alive," she said. "That's more than many can say." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the camp lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the compound. In the guard tower nearest to Barrack 7, Private Daniel Collins stood watch, his rifle resting against the railing. He was 19 years old, from a farm in Nebraska, and he had never seen a pregnant prisoner before. He thought about his mother, who had raised 6 children through the Depression. He thought about his sister, who had just had her first baby while her husband was fighting in the Pacific. He wondered what his mother would say if she knew there were pregnant women locked behind wire in the middle of Texas, sleeping on military cots, afraid of what tomorrow would bring. Collins looked down at the barrack below, where a single light still burned. Through the window, he could see the silhouette of a woman sitting upright, her hands folded over her belly, staring at nothing. He made a decision then, though he didn't fully understand it. Tomorrow, he would find a way to help. Somehow, the night deepened, and across the camp, whispers began to spread among the prisoners. Whispers of fear, of uncertainty, of what the Americans might do to women who carried the children of enemy soldiers. In the darkness, Anna held her belly and hummed a lullaby her own mother had sung, trying to believe that mercy still existed in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The whispers grew louder over the following days, spreading through the camp like fever. The male prisoners had their own theories, each more dire than the last. Some claimed the Americans were building secret facilities where medical experiments would be conducted. Others insisted that pregnant women would be used as leverage, their babies taken as hostages to ensure compliance. An older sergeant, Werner Kessler, who had fought in the First War and now found himself captured in the Second, spoke with grim certainty. "The Americans are no different than anyone else," he said, his voice carrying across the mess hall during breakfast. "They smile and talk about freedom, but put them in charge of their enemies and watch how quickly they become the thing they fought against." His words found fertile ground. Fear feeds on uncertainty, and the prisoners had plenty of both. In Barrack 7, the 4 women heard the rumors and felt the weight of isolation. They were permitted outside for 1 hour each day, always under guard, always watched. The other female prisoners, fewer than a dozen, kept their distance. Some out of fear of association, others because the pregnant women reminded them of everything they had lost. Anna noticed the stares. She felt the judgment in the silence. They were anomalies, complications in a system, designed to process captured soldiers, not expectant mothers. She understood, in an abstract way, that their presence was inconvenient. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. On the third morning, during the daily roll call, Anna felt the world tilt sideways. The heat was oppressive, pressing down like a physical weight. She had eaten little for breakfast, her stomach rebellious, and the baby had been active all night, kicking and turning as though protesting the confines of both womb and camp. The numbers were being called in English. She tried to focus on staying upright, on controlling her breathing, on ignoring the spots that danced at the edges of her vision. But her body had different plans. Her knees buckled, and she felt herself falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. She never hit the dirt. Strong hands caught her, lowering her gently. Through the haze, she heard a voice barking orders. American. Urgent. Get the medic. Now. Someone bring water. When her vision cleared, she was looking up at Captain Howard's face. He knelt beside her, his hands supporting her head, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, in heavily accented but comprehensible German, "Can you hear me?" She nodded. "You're going to be fine. We're taking you to the medical station." "I don't need," she began. But he was already lifting her, carrying her as though she weighed nothing. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence. Carrying an enemy combatant was one thing. Cradling her like she was something precious was another entirely. The medical station occupied a converted storage building near the camp's western fence. Inside, it smelled of iodine and rubbing alcohol. Howard placed Anna on an examination table and stepped back as a medic. Sergeant Ruth Palmer came forward. Palmer was in her 40s, a nurse who had volunteered for military service after her husband died at Normandy. "What happened?" Palmer asked, already checking Anna's pulse. "Heat exhaustion, possibly. She's 7 months pregnant." Howard's voice was clinical, but his eyes betrayed something more complicated. Palmer looked at him, then at Anna, then back at Howard. "You want to explain to me why there are pregnant POWs in this camp, Captain? I don't make policy, Ruth. I just enforce it." "Well, your policy needs a medical reality check. This woman needs proper nutrition, rest, prenatal vitamins, if we can get them. All 4 of them do. You can't treat them like regular prisoners." Howard rubbed the back of his neck. A gesture Palmer had learned meant he was about to make a decision his superiors wouldn't like. "Do what you need to do. Submit the supply requests through me. I'll find a way to justify it." Palmer raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "No," he admitted. "But do it anyway." As Howard turned to leave, Anna spoke, her voice weak but clear. "Thank you." He paused at the door but didn't turn around. After a moment, he said, "Don't thank me yet," and walked out into the blazing sunlight. That evening, Howard sat in his office, staring at the supply request forms Palmer had already delivered. Prenatal vitamins, additional protein rations, softer bedding, a bassinet. He knew what the logistics officer would say. He knew what the questions would be from command. But he also knew what he had seen in Anna Mueller's eyes when she fell. The same fear his wife had carried in those final days, when she knew her body was failing but couldn't stop it. He signed the forms and set them in his outgoing box. Then he pulled out a locked drawer in his desk and removed a photograph. Margaret smiled up at him, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, her eyes bright with hope that would never be fulfilled. He touched the image gently, then put it away and locked the drawer again. Some wounds never heal. But maybe, he thought, they could be transformed into something else, something that looked like redemption. In the guard tower, Private Collins finished his shift and climbed down the ladder. He had watched the entire incident, had seen the captain carry the German woman to medical, had noticed the tenderness that seemed out of place in a prison camp. It had stirred something in him, a question he couldn't quite articulate. Before heading to the barracks, he made a detour to the mess hall. The cooks were cleaning up from dinner, but he knew where they kept the day-old bread. He wrapped 2 rolls in a handkerchief and slipped them into his pocket. Then he walked casually past Barrack 7, glanced around to ensure no one was watching, and tossed the bundle through the window. Inside, Greta picked up the handkerchief and unwrapped it slowly. The bread was still soft. She looked up at the window but saw no one. just the empty space where kindness had passed through, unnamed and unexplained. She broke the bread into 4 pieces and shared it with the others. They ate in silence, each bite tasting like something they had almost forgotten, like the possibility that not everyone in the world had chosen cruelty. That night, Anna lay on her cot, feeling the baby move. Outside, the searchlights swept across the compound in their endless rotation. She thought about the captain who had caught her when she fell. She thought about the medic who had spoken to her like a human being. She thought about the bread that had appeared through the window like a small miracle. Maybe, she allowed herself to think, maybe they would survive this. Maybe the baby would be born here, in this strange land, among people who spoke a language she barely understood. But maybe that child would know something she had never known. Maybe that child would grow up in a world where enemies could become something else, where mercy was possible even in the darkest places. It was a fragile hope, thin as paper, easily torn. But it was hope nonetheless. And in a prison camp in the middle of Texas, in the summer of 1945, hope was the most dangerous and precious thing a person could carry. The days began to develop a rhythm, though not the brutal one the women had expected. Each morning began with roll call, conducted now with Anna and the others permitted to remain seated. Sergeant Palmer visited daily, checking vitals, monitoring the pregnancies with a thoroughness that surprised them all. The additional rations Howard had requisitioned arrived within a week. Milk, eggs, fresh vegetables that the other prisoners rarely saw. This preferential treatment did not go unnoticed. Among the German prisoners, resentment simmered. Sergeant Kessler made his displeasure known during evening gatherings in the men's compound. "They pamper the women to humiliate us," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and rank. "They want us to see that we cannot even protect our own, that we are so defeated they can show mercy to our women and children while we rot behind wire." Some of the younger prisoners nodded, accepting this interpretation. Others remained silent, uncertain. One, a former schoolteacher named Friedrich, dared to question. Perhaps they show mercy because it is the right thing to do. Perhaps not everything is a strategy. Kessler's laugh was harsh. "You are young. You still believe in fairy tales. There is no mercy in war, only tactics." But Friedrich's words lingered, creating small cracks in the edifice of certainty that Kessler had built. In the American ranks, the presence of pregnant prisoners created different tensions. Some soldiers shared Kessler's cynicism, believing that showing kindness to enemy combatants was a betrayal of those who had died fighting them. Others felt uncomfortable with the entire situation, unsure how to reconcile their training with the reality of women who posed no threat. Private Collins belonged to neither camp. He simply did what felt right, in small ways that added up. An extra blanket left folded near the barrack door. A bar of soap, barely used. Once, a handful of wildflowers picked from outside the fence, left on the window ledge without explanation. The women noticed these gifts and began to understand that not all kindness came from official channels. Some kindness was contraband, passed between strangers who chose to see each other as human. 6 weeks after their arrival, on an October evening when the heat had finally broken and the air carried the first hint of autumn, something shifted in Captain Howard. He had been reviewing supply reports when he heard singing drifting across the compound. German voices, harmonizing in a melody he didn't recognize. He stood and walked to the window. The sound came from Barrack 7. All 4 women sat outside on the steps, their faces turned toward the darkening sky, their voices blending in a lullaby so achingly beautiful it made his chest tighten. Other prisoners had stopped to listen. Even the guard stood motionless, caught in the spell of the song. Howard found himself walking toward the sound, his feet carrying him without conscious decision. He stopped 10 feet from the barrack, close enough to hear the words, though he couldn't understand them. Close enough to see Anna's face, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her belly as she sang. When the song ended, silence fell like snow. Anna opened her eyes and saw him standing there. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space that separated guard from guarded, victor from vanquished. Then Howard nodded. a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than words, and turned away. Behind him, he heard Liesel ask in German, "Why do you think he does it? Why does he help us?" Anna's reply was soft. Perhaps because someone he loved needed help once, and there was none to give. Howard kept walking, but her words followed him like ghosts. The nights grew colder, and Howard authorized the distribution of additional blankets. He filed the request under medical necessity, which was true enough. Palmer helped him navigate the bureaucracy, finding loopholes and sympathetic ears in the supply chain. Together, they built a system that provided care without drawing too much attention from command, but attention came anyway. In late October, an inspector from the provost marshal's office arrived unannounced. Colonel Martin Hendricks was a by-the-book officer who had built his career on regulation compliance. He spent 3 days touring the camp, reviewing records, conducting interviews. On the 4th day, he summoned Howard to his office. "Your operation here is generally satisfactory," Hendricks began, his fingers steepled on the desk. "But I have concerns about certain irregularities." Howard waited, his face neutral. "These pregnant prisoners. The medical care they're receiving exceeds standard POW protocols. The additional rations, the private medical visits, the preferential housing. Some might argue you're coddling the enemy. They're expectant mothers, sir. The Geneva Convention requires appropriate medical care. The convention requires adequate care, not comfortable care. There's a difference. With respect, Colonel, I disagree. A pregnant woman who collapses from malnutrition is a medical emergency that creates liability and bad press. Preventing that emergency is efficient resource management." Hendricks studied him for a long moment. "You're parsing words, Captain. Why?" Howard met his gaze directly. "Because it's the right thing to do." "The right thing," Hendricks repeated slowly. "That's a dangerous philosophy in war, Captain. The right thing is to follow orders. The right thing is to remember who the enemy is. I haven't forgotten, sir. But I also haven't forgotten who we are." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, Hendricks leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to recommend that protocols be tightened. No more special treatment. They eat what the other prisoners eat. They sleep where the other prisoners sleep. If they can't handle standard conditions, they can be transferred to a civilian internment facility." "Sir, transferring a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy would be proper procedure," Hendricks interrupted. "You have 2 weeks to bring this camp into full compliance." "Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir." Howard saluted and left the office, his jaw tight with anger he couldn't show. Outside, Collins was waiting, having heard through the camp grapevine that the inspector was unhappy. "Sir, is it true they're cutting the women's rations?" "Not yet. But soon." Howard looked at the young private. "Collins, I need you to understand something. What we've been doing here, the small kindnesses, they're about to get a lot harder. And if you're caught helping, you'll face disciplinary action. I can't protect you." Collins nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. But I'm going to keep doing it anyway." Howard felt something like pride, though he knew better than to show it. "Then be smart about it. And for God's sake, don't get caught." That evening, Howard called Sergeant Palmer to his office and explained the situation. Palmer listened, her expression darkening. "So we're supposed to let a pregnant woman go without proper nutrition because some colonel is worried about public perception? That's the gist of it." Palmer stood and paced the small office. "I didn't join this army to let people suffer for bureaucratic convenience, James. I don't care what the regulations say. Neither do I. But we have to be careful. If they transfer the women out, we lose all ability to help them. At least here, we can find ways around the restrictions." "What kind of ways?" Howard pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. "Medical exemptions. We document every health concern, no matter how minor. We make the case that standard rations are medically insufficient for their specific conditions. We create a paper trail that justifies continued care." Palmer smiled grimly. "You're going to bury them in paperwork. It's the only weapon we have." Over the next 2 weeks, Palmer and Howard waged a quiet war of documentation. Every symptom was recorded. Every potential complication noted. They built a medical file for each pregnant prisoner that was 3 times the size of any other POW record, a fortress of justified exceptions. When Hendricks returned for his follow-up inspection, Howard handed him a stack of reports, 6 inches thick. Full medical documentation. Sir, as you'll see, reducing care for these specific prisoners would constitute a violation of medical standards, which would expose the camp to liability under military medical regulations. Article 12, Section 4. Hendricks flipped through the pages, his expression souring. This is excessive. It's thorough, sir. Another long silence. Then Hendricks closed the file and stood. You're walking a very fine line, Captain Howard. Don't cross it. No, sir. I won't. After Hendricks left, Palmer came to Howard's office and found him sitting in the dark, his head in his hands. You okay? She asked. I'm tired, Ruth. Tired of fighting my own side. Tired of justifying basic human decency. She sat across from him. Then why do you keep doing it? He looked up, and in his eyes, she saw grief still raw after 2 years. Because nobody did it for Margaret. Because when she needed help, I was too far away, and there was no one else. Because maybe if I can help these women, it means something. It means her death wasn't completely pointless. Palmer reached across and squeezed his hand. It wasn't pointless, James. And what you're doing here matters. Don't forget that. He nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. But he would keep going anyway, because what else could he do? In Barrack 7, the women felt the tension without understanding its source. They noticed the guards seemed more watchful. They sensed the calculation behind every decision. But they also noticed that the food kept coming. The medical visits continued, and the small kindnesses persisted. Something is happening, Greta said one night. Something we're not seeing. They're protecting us, Anna replied. But I don't know why. Liesl touched her belly, now enormous at nearly 9 months. Maybe we don't need to know why. Maybe we just need to be grateful. Anna wanted to agree. But gratitude felt complicated when you were still a prisoner, still locked behind wire, still at the mercy of decisions made by people who had every reason to hate you. Still, that night, when another bundle appeared at the window, this time containing a small stuffed bear clearly meant for a baby, Anna picked it up and held it close. Whoever was doing this, whatever their reasons, they were offering more than material comfort. They were offering hope, and in a world still bleeding from years of war, hope was the most subversive gift of all. The baby came on a November night when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the wind howled through gaps in the barrack walls. Anna had been restless all day, unable to find a comfortable position, feeling pressure building in waves that took her breath away. By evening, she knew. The time had come. Greta ran for the guard, her face pale with fear. Collins was on duty. He took one look at Anna, hunched over on her cot, and sprinted for the medical station. Within minutes, Palmer arrived with her medical bag, and Howard came behind her carrying blankets and a kerosene heater. We need to move her to medical, Palmer said, assessing Anna quickly. No time, Anna gasped in broken English. Baby coming now. Palmer looked at Howard. They both knew the medical station wasn't equipped for delivery. It had basic supplies but no obstetric tools. No proper sterilization equipment. No backup if complications arose. But they also knew they had no choice. Collins, get every clean sheet in the supply room. Captain, I need boiling water, towels, and the emergency medical kit from my office. Palmer rolled up her sleeves and knelt beside Anna. You're going to be fine, she said, though her voice carried more conviction than she felt. I've delivered 3 babies. We'll get through this. The next 4 hours unfolded in a blur of pain and effort. Anna labored through contractions that felt like they would split her apart. Palmer coached her through breathing, monitoring her progress with hands that had forgotten how to do this until muscle memory took over. Howard stood outside with Collins, pacing, both men rendered helpless by the ancient mystery happening on the other side of the door. Other prisoners gathered in the darkness, drawn by some collective instinct. German and American, guard and guarded, they waited together in the cold. Someone began to pray in German. Another voice joined in English. The words were different, but the intention was the same. Inside, Anna pushed with everything she had left, screaming through the pain, feeling like she was being torn in two. Then suddenly, impossibly, there was release. And a cry. A high, piercing cry that announced new life in the most defiant way possible. Palmer held up the baby, a boy, pink and squalling and absolutely perfect. She cleaned him quickly, wrapped him in the softest blanket they had, and placed him in Anna's arms. Anna looked down at her son. And the tears came. Not from pain, but from overwhelming love mixed with terror. She had brought a child into this world, into this place of wire and guards, and uncertain futures. What had she done? But as she held him close, feeling his warmth, hearing his cries quiet as he recognized her heartbeat, something shifted. This child was not a product of war. He was something beyond it, something innocent and new and achingly vulnerable. He was possibility. Palmer opened the door, and the cold night air rushed in along with the faces of everyone who had been waiting. Howard stepped forward, and for the first time since they had met, Anna saw him smile. A real smile, unguarded and genuine. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," Anna corrected, her English stumbling but clear. She looked at Palmer, then at Howard. "Thank you. For everything," Howard nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He thought about Margaret, about the son he never got to hold. For 2 years, that loss had been nothing but agony. But standing here, watching this child live when his own had died, he felt something shift. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into something that looked like purpose. Collins pushed through the crowd, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "Ma'am, the guys and I, we got together and made something." Anna opened the package with one hand, careful not to disturb the baby. Inside was a small wooden cradle, roughly made but sturdy, sanded smooth and lined with soft cloth. Carved into the headboard was a simple design, an olive branch. "We didn't have much," Collins said, embarrassed. "But we figured the little guy needed something better than a drawer." Anna looked at the cradle, then at the young soldier, then at the faces gathered around. German prisoners and American guards, strangers from opposite sides of an ocean and a war, all looking at her baby with something like wonder. "He is called Thomas," she said, the name feeling right as soon as she spoke it. "Thomas, for doubt that becomes faith." Palmer laughed softly. "That's perfect." As the crowd dispersed, Howard stayed behind. He looked at the baby, at Anna's exhausted but radiant face, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but something close. Something that suggested happiness might be possible again. "Do you need anything?" he asked. Anna shook her head. "You have given enough." But he came back the next morning with a small box. Inside was a silver rattle, tarnished but beautiful, engraved with initials that weren't Thomas's. "It was meant for my son," Howard said quietly. "He never got to use it. I'd like Thomas to have it." Anna understood what the gesture meant, what it cost him. She took the rattle with shaking hands. "I am sorry for your loss." "So am I," Howard said. "But maybe some good can come from it anyway. Maybe that's what we do. We take the broken pieces and try to make something whole." He left before she could respond, but his words stayed with her. That afternoon, when Thomas slept in his cradle made by enemy soldiers, Anna held the silver rattle and thought about all the losses that had led to this moment, all the grief that had somehow, impossibly, created space for kindness. The war was officially over. The killing had stopped. But the real work of building peace, she realized, happened in small moments like this. In choices to help instead of harm, in decisions to see humanity instead of enemy. Thomas stirred and opened his eyes, unfocused and new. Anna smiled at him through her tears. "You will know a better world," she promised. "We will make sure of it." And in that moment, in a prison camp in Texas, surrounded by wire and guards and the ghosts of war, It felt like a promise she might actually be able to keep. Winter settled over the camp, and with it came an unexpected thaw in the rigid separation between captor and captive. Thomas became the camp's unofficial mascot, a symbol of something beyond the categories that had defined everyone's existence for years. Prisoners who had barely spoken began to smile when they saw him. Guards who had maintained stern professionalism found themselves peeking into the nursery corner of Barrack 7, watching the baby sleep. The change was subtle but profound. In the mess hall, German prisoners and American soldiers began to exchange halting greetings. A few brave souls attempted to teach each other words from their languages, laughing at mispronunciations. Someone produced a harmonica, and music drifted across the compound in the evenings. Old folk songs that sounded similar whether sung in German or English. Melodies that reminded everyone of homes they might never see again. Private Collins became Thomas's most devoted protector, though he tried to hide it behind official duties. He volunteered for every shift that put him near Barrack 7. He used his connections in the supply chain to acquire formula, diapers, baby clothes, sent from charitable organizations. Once, he spent 2 days' pay on a proper baby blanket from town, telling himself it was just maintaining good order in the camp. The other pregnant women watched Anna with a mixture of hope and fear. If childbirth here could be survived, if kindness was possible, maybe they had a chance too. Greta, now showing prominently at 6 months, began to talk about names. Liesel knitted tiny clothes from unraveled yarn, her hands moving with fierce determination, but not everyone welcomed the softening. Sergeant Kessler watched the fraternization with growing disgust. To him, every smile exchanged between German and American was a betrayal. Every gesture of kindness was a capitulation. "You shame yourselves," he said one evening, his voice carrying across the male compound. "You shame everyone who died fighting these people. They bomb our cities, kill our sons, and now you play at friendship because they gave milk to a baby? Have you forgotten everything?" Friedrich, the school teacher, spoke up again. "Perhaps we're remembering something instead of forgetting. Perhaps we're remembering that before we were soldiers, we were people." Kessler's face darkened. "People? We are prisoners. We are defeated. And you celebrate this defeat by cooing over the child of a woman who should have been home, not in uniform. This is what becomes of a nation that lets women fight its wars." Anna heard about the confrontation from another prisoner. That night, she held Thomas close and wondered if Kessler was right. Had she shamed herself by being here? Had she failed some fundamental test by choosing to serve? By finding herself pregnant in captivity? By accepting help from the enemy? But when she looked at her son, perfect and innocent, she couldn't regret the choices that had led to his existence. And when she thought about Captain Howard's grief, about Palmer's professionalism, about Collins's shy gifts, she couldn't see enemies. She saw people trying to do right in circumstances that offered no clear answers. The ethical tangle kept her awake long after Thomas had fallen asleep. In the darkness, she heard footsteps outside, and then a soft knock on the doorframe. Captain Howard stood there, silhouetted against the searchlight. "May I come in?" he asked in German. Anna nodded, adjusting her shawl. Howard entered and stood awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. "I heard about what Sergeant Kessler said. I wanted you to know that his opinion doesn't reflect camp policy. You've done nothing wrong, haven't I?" Anna's voice was soft. "Sometimes I wonder. In my country, they would say I abandoned my duty. Here, you show me kindness I don't deserve. I don't know which side is right anymore." Howard pulled up a small stool and sat, keeping a respectful distance. "I don't think anyone knows what's right anymore. The war gave us clear missions, clear enemies. But now," he gestured around the barrack, "now we're just people trying to figure out how to live with what we've done." "You saved my life," Anna said. "You saved my son." "Why?" Howard was quiet for a long moment. "Because someone should have saved my wife. Because when she was dying, I was thousands of miles away doing my duty, and there was no one to help her. Because every time I see you with Thomas, I see what I lost. And maybe helping you is the only way I know how to make peace with that." Anna felt tears prick her eyes. "I am sorry. Truly, so am I. Sorry for all of it. The war, the waste, the years we can't get back. He stood, preparing to leave. But I'm not sorry for helping you. Whatever Kessler says, whatever my superiors think, that's one thing I'm certain about. After he left, Anna sat in the darkness, thinking about the strange mathematics of grief and kindness. How loss could transform into generosity. How the absence of one child could lead to the protection of another. The world was more complicated than propaganda had taught her. More nuanced than the slogans she had been raised to believe. As Christmas approached, something remarkable happened. The prisoners and guards decided, through unofficial channels and careful coordination, to celebrate together. Not officially, of course. Command would never approve such fraternization. But in the quiet spaces between regulations, in the gaps that existed when officers looked the other way, something like celebration took shape. On Christmas Eve, someone produced a small tree, scraped and thin but decorated with ornaments made from tin cans and paper. It was placed in the common area between the compounds, visible to everyone. German prisoners sang Stille Nacht, while American soldiers hummed Silent Night, the same melody crossing the language barrier like a bridge. Collins had organized a collection among the guards. Small gifts appeared at each barrack. Nothing extravagant: cigarettes, chocolate, warm socks, playing cards. For the pregnant women, there were packages of tea and honey. For Thomas, there was a small wooden horse, carved with surprising skill by a soldier from Montana who had grown up on a ranch. Anna held the horse, running her fingers over the smooth wood, and felt something break open inside her chest. For years, she had lived in a world divided into us and them, ally and enemy, right and wrong. But here, in this strange in-between place, those categories were dissolving. The people around her were no longer abstractions. They were individuals with names and stories, griefs and hopes. That night, she wrote a letter. She had been given permission to send one correspondence per month, though she had no idea if her words would ever reach their destination. She wrote to her mother in Hamburg. If her mother still lived, if the address still existed, "I have given birth to a son," she wrote in careful script. "His name is Thomas. He was born in a place I never expected to be, cared for by people I was taught to hate. But Mama, they are not what I was told. They grieve as we grieve. They love as we love. Perhaps the greatest lie of the war was not about territory or ideology, but about the nature of the enemy. Perhaps we were all just people, convinced by leaders that we were something more." She sealed the letter, knowing it might never be read, but needing to write it anyway. Some truths needed to be spoken, even into silence. January brought bitter cold and new complications. Liesel went into labor 2 weeks early, her delivery difficult and dangerous. Palmer worked through the night, her hands steady, even as fear gripped her chest. At one point, the baby's heartbeat faltered, and Palmer had to make a split-second decision to use forceps she had never used before, following half-remembered training from years ago. Howard stood outside again, this time with Friedrich and several other German prisoners who had asked permission to wait. The boundaries were blurring. When Liesel's screams cut through the night, Friedrich flinched as though the pain was his own. "She was my student," he said quietly. "Before the war, she wanted to be a teacher like me. I tried to convince her not to join up, but she was young and believed in the cause." He shook his head. "Now look at us. Everything we believed in is ash, and she's suffering behind enemy wire. She's not suffering alone," Howard said. "That counts for something." Friedrich looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. "You are not what I expected of Americans. The propaganda said you were soft, decadent, without principle. And what did your propaganda say about yourselves?" Friedrich's laugh was bitter, that we were superior, destined to rule, that our cause was righteous. He paused. "I think perhaps the greatest casualty of this war is not the dead, but the certainty of the living. We can never be sure of anything again. Before Howard could respond, a cry came from inside. Not Liesel's voice this time, but higher, thinner. A baby. Palmer emerged minutes later, exhausted but smiling. A girl, she announced, small but healthy. Liesel's asking for water and her mother, in that order. The men laughed, the tension breaking like fever. Friedrich wiped his eyes unashamedly. A girl. She always wanted a daughter. The baby was named Clara, and she had Liesel's blonde hair and blue eyes. 2 babies now in the camp, 2 lives that had begun in captivity but belonged to neither side. They were simply themselves, innocent and demanding, and utterly unconcerned with the politics that had brought their mothers to this place. But kindness has enemies, and bureaucracy has teeth. In February, a telegram arrived from the War Department. An anonymous complaint had been filed, alleging that Camp Hearn was providing preferential treatment to enemy prisoners. An investigation was ordered. Captain Howard was to prepare for a formal review. Palmer found him in his office, the telegram crumpled in his fist. "They're coming for us," he said flatly. "Let them come. We've broken no laws. We've broken the spirit of the thing. They wanted us to warehouse prisoners until they could be shipped home. Instead, I don't know what we've been doing. Playing family?" Palmer sat down across from him. "We've been being human. That's not a crime. James, in war? Maybe it is." The investigation began 3 weeks later. A team of 3 officers arrived, led by a colonel who had fought in the Pacific and had no patience for what he called coddling Nazis. He interviewed prisoners and guards separately, poring over supply records, photographing the nursery area in Barrack 7. Collins was called in for questioning. They asked him about the gifts, the extra rations, the times he had been seen talking to prisoners beyond the scope of duty. He answered honestly, refusing to lie even when the interrogator's tone suggested he should. "Do you understand," the interrogator asked, "that these people were our enemies, that they fought for a regime that committed unspeakable atrocities?" "Yes, sir. But the women in Barrack 7 never ran a concentration camp. They were nurses and operators. And the babies are just babies. They didn't choose any of this." "That's not the point, Private." "Then what is the point, sir?" The interrogator had no answer that satisfied either of them. The questioning moved to Howard, and it was brutal. They went line by line through supply requisitions, questioning every extra blanket, every medical visit, every decision that deviated from standard protocol. They accused him of sympathy with the enemy, of dereliction of duty, of allowing his personal grief to compromise his judgment. Howard took it all without flinching. When they finished, he said simply, "I would do it all again. Court-martial me, if you want, but those women and children are alive and healthy because of the decisions I made, and I will defend those decisions until my last breath." The lead investigator leaned back, studying him. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Captain. Maybe both, but I'm also right." 3 days later, the investigation team departed without issuing a formal report. The lead investigator called Howard to his office before leaving. "Off the record," he said, "what you did here complicates things. It raises questions we're not ready to answer, about how we treat prisoners, about what victory means, about what kind of country we want to be now that the war is over." He paused. "But you didn't break any rules I can prove. You bent them damn near to breaking, but you didn't cross the line. So, officially, this investigation finds no wrongdoing." Howard felt relief and disappointment in equal measure. "And unofficially? Unofficially? What you did was either the best or worst example of military conduct I've ever seen. I'm still deciding which." The investigator extended his hand. "Take care of those babies, Captain. God knows someone should." After he left, Howard allowed himself to sit down and breathe. Palmer came in without knocking and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle she kept in her medical bag for emergencies. "To surviving bureaucracy," she said, raising her glass. "To doing what's right anyway," Howard countered. They drank in silence, 2 people who had found themselves in an impossible situation and somehow navigated through it. Outside, through the window, they could see Collins playing with Thomas, making faces that delighted the baby. In the distance, Liesel walked with Clara bundled against her chest, singing softly. "It's almost over," Palmer said. "They'll be shipped back to Germany soon. Repatriation is starting next month." "I know. Are you going to be all right when they leave?" Howard didn't answer immediately. He watched Thomas laugh at something Collins did, the sound carrying across the cold air. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I think maybe Margaret would be proud. I think maybe I've finally done something that honors her memory instead of just mourning it." Palmer squeezed his shoulder. "She would be proud. I'm certain of it." The weeks that followed were bittersweet, filled with preparations for departure. The prisoners would be returning to a Germany that no longer existed as they remembered it. A country divided and devastated, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead. The victory the Allies celebrated was the prisoners' catastrophic loss, and yet the line between victor and vanquished had become so blurred that it was hard to remember why the distinction had ever seemed so important. Anna packed the few belongings she had accumulated: the baby clothes Collins had found, the wooden cradle made by soldiers, the silver rattle that had belonged to Howard's lost son. Each item carried the weight of unexpected kindness, proof that even in the machinery of war, individual humans could choose mercy. On the final night before departure, Howard visited Barrack 7 one last time. Anna sat with Thomas, now 4 months old and smiling easily. Clara slept in Liesel's arms. Greta and the fourth woman, Helga, who had given birth to a son named Peter in March, sat together on the porch steps. "I wanted to say goodbye," Howard said, his German still imperfect but sincere, "and to wish you well, all of you. You saved our lives," Anna said. "How do we repay such a debt?" "You don't. You live. You raise those children to be better than we were. You tell them that enemies can become friends, that mercy is always possible, that the world can heal if we let it." Anna stood and walked to him, Thomas in her arms. "Would you like to hold him one last time?" Howard hesitated, then nodded. He took the baby carefully, cradling him with the tenderness of someone who had been denied this simple act. Thomas looked up at him with wide eyes, reaching for his face with tiny fingers. Howard felt tears slip down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. "Goodbye, Thomas," he whispered. "Be good. Be kind. Be everything we failed to be." He handed the baby back and turned to leave before his composure shattered completely. At the door, he paused. "Anna, thank you for letting me help, for giving me a purpose when I had none." "The debt is ours," she replied. "Always." The next morning, trucks arrived to transport the prisoners to the port. The entire camp turned out to watch them leave, an unofficial farewell that broke every regulation about fraternization. Guards shook hands with prisoners. Addresses were exchanged, promises made to write, though everyone knew most would never follow through. Collins carried Thomas to the truck, playing with him one last time before handing him to Anna. "You take care of this little guy," he said, his voice rough. Tell him that not everyone in America hated him. Tell him some of us thought he was pretty great." "I will tell him," Anna promised. "I will tell him about all of you, about the kindness you showed when you had every reason not to." The trucks pulled away, and Howard stood watching until they disappeared beyond the gate. Beside him, Palmer wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Think we'll ever hear from them again?" she asked. "No," Howard said. "But that's not why we did it." "Then why did we?" He thought about Margaret, about the son he never held, about the ways grief can transform into grace if you let it. Because some things matter more than winning. Some things matter more than sides. The camp seemed emptier after they left, though dozens of other prisoners remained. The cradles were donated to a local church. The extra supplies were redistributed. Life returned to the mundane rhythms of administration and protocol. But something had changed in the people who remained, a crack in the certainty that had carried them through war. Collins found himself less sure about the categories he had grown up believing in. Palmer discovered that healing sometimes looked like rebellion against regulations. Howard learned that loss could become something other than endless pain if you transformed it into service. And in a ship crossing the Atlantic, Anna held Thomas close and looked toward a horizon she couldn't see, carrying in her arms proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could break through. The ship docked in Bremen in April of 1946, releasing its cargo of prisoners into a Germany that barely resembled the one they had left. Cities were skeletal ruins. Survivors moved through rubble with hollow eyes, searching for family members who might still live, for homes that no longer existed. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left a scar that would take generations to heal. Anna made her way to Hamburg with Thomas bundled against the spring cold. Her childhood home was gone, reduced to a crater filled with debris. Neighbors told her that her mother had died in the bombing of July 1943. Her father shortly after from grief or illness. No one was certain which. Her brother was missing, last seen retreating through Poland ahead of Soviet forces. She stood in the ruins with Thomas in her arms and felt the full weight of loss finally catch up to her. Everything she had known was gone. The country that had sent her to war no longer existed. The ideals she had believed in had revealed themselves as monstrous lies. She was alone in a destroyed world with an infant who depended on her completely. But when Thomas began to cry, hungry and cold, she found reserves she didn't know she possessed. She had survived a war, captivity, childbirth in a prison camp. She had witnessed kindness from enemies and hatred from allies. She knew now that the world was more complicated than anyone admitted, and that survival required both strength and flexibility. She found work in a hospital, her nursing training still valuable in a country desperate for medical care. She lived in a displaced persons camp for 6 months, then in a small apartment shared with 2 other women and their children. The years were hard. Food was scarce. Heating was irregular. The psychological wounds of the war ran deeper than the physical devastation. But Anna had learned something in that Texas prison camp, something that sustained her through the darkest times. She had learned that small acts of kindness could create ripples that spread far beyond their initial gesture. She had learned that seeing the humanity in others, even enemies, was not weakness, but strength. She raised Thomas to be gentle, to be curious, to question authority but respect truth. She told him stories about his birth, about the American soldiers who had helped when they had no obligation to do so. She taught him that nationality mattered less than character, that the capacity for good and evil existed in every human heart, and that we choose which one to nurture. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself, transformed its shame into determination never to repeat its mistakes. The Cold War divided the world into new categories of enemy and ally, proving that humanity's capacity for tribalism was limitless. But in small pockets, in individual lives, the lessons of war continued to resonate. Thomas grew strong and bright, driven by a desire to heal that his mother recognized as an inheritance from those strange months in captivity. He studied medicine, specializing in pediatrics, drawn to protecting the most vulnerable. He became the kind of doctor who sat with frightened parents, who explained complex diagnoses with patience, who saw each child as infinitely precious. He kept the silver rattle on his desk, tarnished but treasured. He kept the wooden horse from the Montana soldier, and when patients asked about these objects, he told them the story his mother had told him, about kindness in an unlikely place, about enemies who chose mercy, about the ways individuals can defy the systems they serve. In 1965, 20 years after his birth in a Texas prison camp, Thomas wrote a letter. His mother had saved the name and address of Captain James Howard, though she had never used it, never felt she could adequately express what his actions had meant. But Thomas felt he had to try. "Dear Captain Howard," he began, writing in careful English his mother had taught him. "You do not know me, but you saved my life before I was old enough to remember. My mother has told me the story many times, of how you helped her when you had every reason not to, of how you treated her with dignity when she expected only punishment. I am writing to tell you that your kindness did not end with my birth. It shaped the entire course of my life. Because of you, I became a doctor. Because of you, I have dedicated my career to saving children. Because of you, I understand that mercy is always possible, even in circumstances that seem to demand cruelty. I have saved 137 lives in my career so far. Every one of them is also your legacy. With gratitude beyond words, Dr. Thomas Mueller. He included a photograph of himself in his white coat, the silver rattle visible on his desk, the "Hui Here," the American military pin Collins had given him at birth pinned to his lapel. He mailed the letter to the address his mother had kept, not knowing if it would reach its destination, if Howard still lived, if this gesture would mean anything after so much time. 3 months later, a response arrived. The handwriting was shaky, aged, but the words were clear. "Dear Thomas," it read, "your letter arrived on the anniversary of the day my wife died. For 23 years, that date has been the hardest day of the year for me. But your letter transformed it. You have given me something I lost when Margaret and our son died. You have given me purpose to my grief. You have shown me that the worst moments of our lives can become seeds for something beautiful if we have the courage to plant them. I am an old man now, retired from the Army, living quietly in Virginia. But your letter has filled my remaining days with light. Thank you for writing. Thank you for becoming the person you are. And please, tell your mother that I think of her often, that I hope she found peace in the ruins we all helped create. If mercy can grow in a prison camp in Texas, it can grow anywhere. That's the hope we have to hold on to. With respect and admiration, James Howard." Anna read the letter through tears, holding it carefully as though it might dissolve. She had carried the weight of gratitude for 20 years, unable to express it, unable to fully repay the debt. Now, in Howard's words, she found release. Not because the debt was paid, some debts could never be fully settled, but because she understood that Howard had never wanted repayment. He had wanted transformation. He had wanted the pain to mean something. She wrote her own letter then, shorter but no less heartfelt, telling Howard about the life she had built from rubble, about the lessons she had learned, about the ways his kindness had echoed through decades. She told him that she had named Thomas after the disciple who doubted until he saw proof, because her son was proof that goodness existed even in the machinery of war. Howard wrote back. And for the next 7 years until his death in 1972, they maintained a correspondence. Not frequent, a few letters a year at most, but each one carrying weight. They became witnesses to each other's lives, connected by a brief intersection during humanity's darkest hour. When Howard died, his daughter sent Anna his medals and a letter he had written to be delivered after his death. In it, he confessed that helping the pregnant prisoners had saved his life as surely as it had saved theirs. That it had given him a reason to continue when grief threatened to consume him. That Thomas and the other babies had represented everything worth fighting for. Everything the war had threatened to destroy. "We tell ourselves stories about war," he wrote. "About heroes and villains. About righteous causes and evil enemies. But the truth is messier than that. The truth is that we are all capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous kindness, and every day we choose which one to embody. You and your son are proof that even in our worst moments, we can still choose mercy. That may be the most important legacy any of us can leave." Anna kept that letter for the rest of her life, along with the medals Howard had earned, not for combat but for service. She shared them with Thomas, and later with his children, her grandchildren, born into a world that had forgotten nothing but learned everything. In 1991, when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified, Thomas stood in the crowd and thought about his mother's stories, about how walls, whether physical or ideological, could come down if people chose to see each other as human rather than as enemy. He thought about Captain Howard and Private Collins and Sergeant Palmer, about how a few individuals had defied the logic of their time to do what was right rather than what was expected. And he understood then what his mother had been trying to teach him his entire life. That history is not just made by leaders and armies, but by ordinary people making moral choices in difficult circumstances. That kindness is not weakness but the hardest form of courage. That we are never so trapped by our circumstances that we cannot choose mercy. Anna Mueller died in 1998 at the age of 79, surrounded by her son, her grandchildren, and the objects that had defined her strange journey. The wooden cradle, still sturdy after 5 decades. The silver rattle that had belonged to another baby in another life. The letters from a man who had been her enemy and became her savior. At her funeral, Thomas spoke about her strength, her resilience, her capacity for forgiveness. But he also spoke about the Americans who had helped her when they had no obligation to do so, about how their kindness had rippled forward through time, creating circles of compassion that spread far beyond what they could have imagined. "My mother taught me," he said, "that we are never only the products of our worst moments. We are also shaped by our choices in those moments. She could have let bitterness consume her. She could have taught me to hate. But instead, she taught me to remember the good, along with the bad. To honor those who chose mercy when cruelty was easier, and to pass that lesson forward, again and again, until maybe the world learns that there is no enemy so complete that we cannot see their humanity if we try." After the service, an elderly man approached Thomas. He was American, visiting Germany for the first time since the war, his body bent with age but his eyes still sharp. "I was at Camp Hearn," he said quietly. "I was just a kid then, 19 years old, scared of everything. I watched Captain Howard help your mother. I watched him fight the whole damn army to do what was right. And I learned something I never forgot. That real courage is not just fighting enemies. It's refusing to become one." Thomas gripped the old soldier's hand, fighting tears. "Were you Collins?" The man smiled. "I was. And I've thought about your mother and you every day of my life since. Wondered if you made it. Hoped you did. I'm so glad I got to meet you before the end." They stood together in the German cemetery, two men whose lives had intersected before either could remember, bound by a story that proved mercy was always possible, even when everything suggested otherwise. Around them, stones marked the dead of 2 world wars, silent testimony to the cost of hatred. But Thomas and Collins represented something else. They represented the fragile, persistent hope that humans can choose differently. That even in our darkest hours, light can break through if we open our eyes to see it. Years later, Thomas would donate Howard's medals and letters to a museum dedicated to reconciliation and peace. He would speak at schools, telling the story of his birth to students who had never known war but needed to understand both its horrors and the small mercies that could grow even in its shadow. And always, he would carry the silver rattle in his pocket, a reminder that he was born in a prison camp but raised by love. That he was the product of war but also the product of kindness. That his existence itself was proof that human decency could survive even when everything conspired to destroy it. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not the military triumph that ended the war, but the personal triumph of individuals who refused to let hate have the final word, who chose, in small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, to see humanity in the enemy, to offer mercy when punishment was expected, to plant seeds of compassion in the sterile ground of conflict. Those seeds grew. They always do, and their harvest is measured not in territory claimed or enemies defeated, but in lives transformed, in cycles of hatred broken, in the quiet persistence of hope against all reasonable expectation. Thomas Müller lived to be 76 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep in 2021. He saved countless lives, taught hundreds of doctors, and raised 3 children who inherited his capacity for compassion. On his desk, when they cleared his office, they found the silver rattle, the wooden horse, and a photograph of a young American captain holding a newborn baby with tears streaming down his face. Below the photograph, in Howard's own hand, were written 4 words that summarized everything both men had learned from their unlikely intersection. Mercy is always possible. It was true then. It remains true now. And as long as we remember stories like this one, as long as we honor those who chose kindness when cruelty was easier, it will continue to be true. Some wounds from war never fully heal, but from those wounds, if we tend them with care, new life can grow. Life that honors both the fallen and the surviving. Life that transforms grief into grace. Life that proves, again and again, that we are never so broken that we cannot build something beautiful from the pieces. That is the legacy of Anna Mueller and James Howard and all those who chose mercy in Camp Hearn. That is the gift they gave the world, and that is the story we must remember. Not because it erases the horrors of war, but because it reminds us that even in the midst of horror, humanity persists. And sometimes, just sometimes, humanity wins.